February 17, 1944, 0430 hours, Western Pacific Ocean. Before dawn, sailors on 9 American carriers work like a single, silent machine. They launch hundreds of planes that will fly farther, strike harder, and come back to be refueled and launched again. Truck, once a symbol of Japanese naval might, becomes a grave, while carriers stay well beyond the guns. The lesson is brutal and simple. Democracy's factories beat fortress doctrine. Watch how one strike proved you can smash an empire from the sea.
February 17, 1944, 0430 hours, Western Pacific Ocean. The darkness before dawn lay heavy over the sea. 60 miles northwest of Truk Lagoon, the water moved in long, silent swells beneath a sky still thick with stars. No moon. Only the faint phosphorescence trailing behind steel hulls cutting through black water. The air tasted of salt and diesel fuel. On the flight decks of 9 American aircraft carriers, men moved in near silence, their breath misting in the tropical night that had turned unexpectedly cold. They wore cloth helmets and kapok life vests. Their hands worked by muscle memory, rolling out Grumman Hellcats and Douglas Dauntlesses from the hangar bays below, chalking wheels, loading ammunition belts, arming bombs and torpedoes. The only sounds were the rhythmic clang of ordnance carts, the whisper of hydraulics, and the low thrum of idling engines that vibrated through the wooden planks beneath their feet. Somewhere in that darkness, beyond the horizon where the ocean met the void, lay the most heavily fortified Japanese naval base in the Central Pacific, a fortress the Imperial Navy had called impregnable, an anchorage so vast and so deep it could shelter the entire combined fleet, a lagoon the Americans had not dared approach for 2 years. But dawn was coming, and with it, Task Force 58. The concept had been ridiculed. When the United States Navy first proposed the construction of purpose-built aircraft carriers in the years before Pearl Harbor, naval theorists in Berlin and Tokyo had dismissed the idea as a grotesque waste of resources. The carrier, they argued, was an auxiliary vessel at best, useful for reconnaissance, perhaps for striking undefended coastal targets, but fundamentally vulnerable, fundamentally incapable of projecting sustained offensive power against fortified positions. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, who would later command the attack on Pearl Harbor, had studied carrier doctrine at length and concluded that while carriers possessed tactical flexibility, they could never replace the battleship as the arbiter of naval supremacy. The logic seemed sound. A carrier was large, expensive, lightly armored, and required an entire flotilla of escorts to protect it. It carried perhaps 70 aircraft, each smaller and less durable than land-based bombers. Its flight deck was a vulnerability. One well-placed bomb could render it useless. By contrast, a battleship was a fortress unto itself, capable of absorbing tremendous punishment while delivering broadsides that could shatter enemy ships at 20 miles. The battleship had ruled the oceans for 3 centuries. The carrier was an experiment, a novelty, a floating airfield that seems to violate every principle of concentration of force that had governed naval warfare since Trafalgar. Japanese naval architects had mocked the American obsession with carriers. They called them soft targets. During the construction of the Essex-class carriers in 1941 and 1942, intercepted intelligence reports from Tokyo described the American shipbuilding program with barely concealed contempt. The Americans, it was said, were building ships that would be sunk within hours of encountering the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet. Japan possessed the Yamato and Musashi, the 2 largest battleships ever constructed, each displacing 70,000 tons and armed with 9 18-inch guns capable of hurling shells weighing more than a Volkswagen Beetle over 25 miles. These were instruments of annihilation. The American carriers, by comparison, seemed fragile, their wooden flight decks and aviation gasoline storage tanks vulnerable to the kind of punishment that battleships were designed to endure. When the Yorktown was sunk at Midway in June 1942, Japanese propagandists celebrated it as proof of concept.
The carrier, one broadcast declared, is a weapon of desperation, not domination. But Midway had been a turning point no one in Tokyo fully understood at the time. The United States had lost one carrier. Japan had lost 4. And in the 20 months since, American shipyards had been engaged in an industrial mobilization unprecedented in human history. The Essex-class carriers were not experiments. They were assembly line products. Between 1943 and the end of the war, the United States would commission 17 fleet carriers of the Essex class alone, each displacing 27,000 tons and capable of carrying 90 aircraft. They were joined by dozens of smaller escort carriers, converted
from merchant hulls, each adding another 30 aircraft to the growing air armada. By early 1944, the United States Navy possessed more carrier-based aircraft than the entire Japanese Army Air Force. The floating airfield had become a floating air force, and it was mobile. Battleships were tied to fuel depots, to predictable patrol routes, to the logistics of their own immense weight. Carriers could strike from anywhere, disappear into the vastness of the Pacific, and reappear 500 miles away. They were not fortresses, they were phantoms. Truk Lagoon had been Japan's answer to American carrier mobility. Located in the Caroline Islands, roughly equidistant from the Philippines, New Guinea, and the Marshall Islands, Truk was a natural fortress. The lagoon itself measured 40 miles across, enclosed by a barrier reef and dotted with more than 200 islands, many of them fortified with coastal artillery, anti-aircraft batteries, and seaplane bases. The anchorage was deep enough to shelter battleships and protected enough to allow ships to refuel, rearm, and repair without fear of submarine attack. By 1944, Truk had become the logistical heart of Japan's southern defense perimeter. It was home to the 4th Fleet, the primary naval force responsible for defending Japanese holdings in the Central and South Pacific. More than 50 warships and transports lay at anchor within the lagoon at any given time. Fuel depots, ammunition bunkers, repair facilities, barracks, hospitals, and supply warehouses covered the larger islands. The Japanese called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific. American sailors, who had never seen it and whose intelligence reports described it in ominous detail, called it something else, the target they could not reach. Truk had remained untouched since the outbreak of war. American submarines had occasionally penetrated the outer reef, sinking a transport here or a tanker there, but the lagoon's defenses made sustained operations impossible. Land-based bombers from the Solomons lacked the range to reach Truk in return. The island fortresses of the Marshalls lay between American forces and the Caroline Islands, and until those were neutralized, Truk remained beyond the reach of American air power. Or, so the Japanese believed. Admiral Minneichi Koga, commander of the combined fleet, had positioned his headquarters staff on Truk precisely because he considered it invulnerable. Intelligence reports from late 1943 indicated that the Americans were advancing through the Central Pacific, but their progress was slow, methodical, island by island. The invasion of the Gilbert Islands in November 1943 had cost the Americans dearly. Tarawa alone had produced more than 3,000 casualties in 76 hours of fighting. At that rate, Koga calculated it would take years for American forces to reach the Carolines. Truk was safe, the fleet was safe, the war could still be won. But the Americans were not coming island by island, they were leapfrogging. On February 1, 1944, the 4th Marine Division landed on Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands, bypassing the heavily fortified outer islands and striking directly at the administrative center of Japan's Central Pacific defenses. Kwajalein fell in 4 days. 1 week later, American forces seized Eniwetok Atoll, leaping another 300 miles westward and placing them within striking distance of Truk. The Japanese High Command, stunned by the speed of the American advance, ordered the immediate evacuation of major fleet units from Truk Lagoon. On February 10, Admiral Koga withdrew the super battleships Yamato and Musashi along with most of the combined fleet's heavy cruisers and destroyers, relocating them to Palau in the Western Carolines. But the evacuation was incomplete. Dozens of smaller warships, transports, tankers, and auxiliaries remained at anchor.
Thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and supplies remained in storage. And most critically, more than 360 aircraft remained stationed on Truk's airfields and seaplane bases, their crews confident that American carriers would never dare approach close enough to launch a strike. They were wrong. Task Force 58 was the largest concentration of naval air power ever assembled. Commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, a quiet, sun-weathered aviator who had commanded the carrier Hornet during the Doolittle raid, the task force consisted of 9 fleet carriers, 6 light carriers, 8 battleships, 6 cruisers, and 36 destroyers. Together, they carried
more than 500 combat aircraft. The force had departed Majuro Atoll in the Marshall Islands on February 12, steaming westward under strict radio silence. For 5 days, the task force moved through empty ocean, refueling at sea, maintaining a speed of 25 knots, advancing toward a target the Japanese still believed to be beyond reach. Reconnaissance aircraft from Truk had searched the approaches to the lagoon daily, sweeping arcs that extended 200 miles in every direction. They found nothing. The ocean was empty. The Americans, if they were coming at all, were still weeks away. On the evening of February 16th, as the sun set over Truk Lagoon, Japanese sailors and airmen went about their routines with the calm assurance of men who believed themselves safe. Some wrote letters, others played cards or listened to radio broadcasts from Tokyo. In the officers' mess aboard the light cruiser Katori, men drank sake and discussed the progress of the war. The news was not encouraging. The loss of the Marshalls had been a blow, but Truk remained secure, and as long as Truk held, the southern perimeter could be reinforced. No one imagined that at that very moment, 60 miles to the northwest, 72 Hellcat fighters were being armed and fueled for a pre-dawn launch. The first strike launched at 600 hours, just as the sky began to pale in the east. The Hellcats went first, tasked with achieving air superiority over the lagoon before the bombers arrived. They flew in groups of 8, stacked at different altitudes, their Pratt & Whitney engines roaring in the thin morning air. Below them, the ocean was still dark, but ahead, on the horizon, the islands of Truk were beginning to emerge from shadow. The pilots could see the volcanic peaks of Dublon and Moen rising against the dawn, and as they descended toward the lagoon, they could see the anchorage itself, a vast expanse of sheltered water dotted with the silhouettes of ships. Dozens of ships, transports, tankers, destroyers, cruisers, all at anchor, unmoving, unprotected. On the airfields at
Eton, Perham, and Moyenne, aircraft sat in neat rows, their engines cold, their crews still asleep. The Hellcats dropped to 5,000 feet, then 3,000, then 1,000. Anti-aircraft fire began to blossom around them, black puffs of flak that hung in the air like smudges of ink. But it was sporadic, disorganized. The Japanese had been caught entirely by surprise. The Hellcats strafed the airfields first, roaring in at low altitude, their 6 50 caliber machine guns tearing through parked aircraft. Mitsubishi Zeros, Nakajima Kates, Aichi Vals, all caught on the ground, all burning within minutes. Fuel trucks exploded, ammunition dumps detonated. Hangars collapsed in on themselves, their metal frames buckling under the heat. The few Japanese aircraft that managed to get airborne were overwhelmed. The Hellcat was faster, more heavily armed, and flown by pilots who had trained over the skies of California and Texas, men who had practiced air-to-air gunnery until they could hit a moving target at 400 yards. The Zero had been a terrifying opponent in 1941 and 1942, but by 1944, it was obsolete. Its lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks made it vulnerable to even glancing hits. Within the first 30 minutes of combat, more than 30 Japanese aircraft were shot down. By 0700 hours, the skies over Truk belonged entirely to the Americans. The dive bombers came next. Douglas Dauntlesses and Curtiss Helldivers, each carrying a single 1,000-pound bomb, circled high above the lagoon before rolling into near vertical dives. The sound was unlike anything the Japanese defenders had heard before, a shrieking metallic howl as the bombers plummeted toward their targets at terminal velocity. The bombs fell with uncanny precision. The light cruiser Agano, already damaged by an American submarine 2 weeks earlier and under repair at Truk, took 3 direct hits and capsized within minutes. The destroyer Fumizuki exploded in a geyser of fire and steam, breaking in half and sinking in less than a minute. The submarine tender Hyanmaru, a converted passenger liner that had been requisitioned by the Imperial Navy, was struck by 4
bombs and sank with more than 500 men aboard. Fuel tanks on Dublin Island ignited, sending columns of black smoke thousands of feet into the air. The smoke was visible for 70 miles, a funeral pyre that marked the death of Japan's most secure anchorage. The attack continued for 2 days. Wave after wave of American aircraft struck the lagoon, hitting targets with methodical efficiency. On February 17 alone, American pilots flew more than 30 sorties against Truk, sinking 12 warships, 32 transports and auxiliaries, and destroying 270 aircraft. The Japanese defenders fought back with everything they had, but it was futile. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, but American bombers flew too high and dove too fast for the gunners to track. Japanese fighters that managed to take off from auxiliary airstrips were intercepted and destroyed before they could reach the carriers. The lagoon, once a symbol of Japanese security, had become a killing zone. And through it all, the American carriers remained beyond the reach of Japanese counterattack. Task Force 58 operated 60 miles offshore, constantly moving, its escorts forming a defensive screen that no Japanese aircraft could penetrate. The floating airfield, the vulnerable novelty that Japanese strategists had dismissed, had become an instrument of annihilation. In Tokyo, the news was received with disbelief. Admiral Koga, who had evacuated the major fleet units just days before the attack, issued a statement praising the heroic resistance of Truk's defenders. But privately, he understood the magnitude of the disaster. Truk was no longer a safe anchorage, it was a grave. More than 4,000 Japanese sailors and airmen had been killed. Thousands more were stranded on the islands, cut off from resupply, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Because the Americans did not need to invade Truk. They had neutralized it without setting foot on its shores. The concept was revolutionary. For centuries, military doctrine had held that territory could only be secured by physical occupation. But the Carrier Task Force had demonstrated a different truth, that air superiority could render territory irrelevant. Truk still held Japanese troops, Japanese supplies, Japanese infrastructure, but none of it mattered. The Americans simply flew over it, ignored it, and moved on. The pilots who returned to Task Force 58 on the evening of February 18 climbed out of their cockpits exhausted, their flight suits soaked with sweat, their hands shaking from adrenaline. They had flown missions that would have been considered impossible 2 years earlier. They had struck a target 2,000 miles from the nearest American airfield, destroyed an enemy fleet in its own harbor, and returned without losing a single carrier. Casualties had been light, 25 aircraft lost, most to anti-aircraft fire, a handful to mechanical failure. Out of more than 500 aircraft committed to the operation, the loss rate was less than 5%. By any measure, it was one of the most successful naval air operations in history. And yet, as the pilots gathered in the ready rooms to debrief, there was little celebration. They understood, perhaps better than their commanders, what they had just proven. The carrier was no longer an auxiliary, it was the fleet. The symbol that emerged from Truk was not a ship or a weapon, but something far simpler, the consistency of American logistics. Japanese soldiers who survived the attack and were later captured reported a detail that appeared in multiple interrogation transcripts. The American aircraft returned again and again, wave after wave, without pause, without exhaustion. There was no sense that the Americans were operating at the limit of their resources. The bombs kept falling, the bullets kept firing, the planes kept coming. One captured pilot, a warrant officer who had flown Zeros from Eton Airfield, described watching American bombers circle overhead for more than an hour, waiting for their turn to dive. It was like a factory, he said. They were not fighting, they were working. The statement was more profound than he realized. The American war effort was, in fact, industrial. It was not driven by ideology or desperation, but by the methodical application of productive capacity.
The carriers themselves were symbols of this vast, complex machines that required thousands of workers to build, thousands more to operate, and an unbroken supply chain stretching back across the Pacific to shipyards in Newport News, Philadelphia, and San Francisco. Each carrier consumed more than 500 tons of fuel per day. Each aircraft required hours of maintenance for every hour of flight time. The ammunition expenditure at Truk exceeded 10,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition and more than 500 tons of bombs. And yet, at no point during the operation did Task Force 58 run short of supplies. The floating airfield was not vulnerable, it was inexhaustible. Japanese military planners had built their strategy on the assumption that American will would break before American industry could be fully mobilized. They believed that a democracy, confronted with heavy casualties and a protracted war in the Pacific, would seek a negotiated peace rather than endure the cost of total victory. This belief was rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of American character. The United States had not entered the war reluctantly out of weakness, but deliberately after provocation. And once committed, the American people had proved willing to endure rationing, conscription, and industrial regimentation on a scale that exceeded even the efforts of totalitarian states. By 1944, the United States was producing more war materiel than all of the Axis powers combined. The carrier task forces were merely the most visible expression of this disparity. Behind each carrier lay a network of supply ships, repair ships, tankers, and tenders. Behind those lay a fleet of cargo vessels transporting fuel, ammunition, and spare parts from the United States. Behind those lay the factories themselves, the aircraft plants in California, the steel mills in Pennsylvania, the oil refineries in Texas. The war in the Pacific was not being fought ship to ship or plane to plane. It was being fought economy to economy, and Japan had already lost. The attack on Truk marked the end of the defensive phase of the Pacific War. After February 1944, Japanese forces would never again mount a credible offensive operation. The Imperial Navy, already weakened by losses at Midway, the Solomons, and the Philippine Sea, was reduced to a defensive posture, husbanding its remaining strength for a final, apocalyptic battle that would never come on terms favorable to Japan. The carrier task forces continued westward, striking Saipan, Tinian, Guam, and Peleliu. Each operation followed the same pattern. Carriers approached under cover of darkness, launched massive airstrikes at dawn, neutralized enemy air power, supported amphibious landings, and then withdrew to refuel and rearm before moving on to the next target. The Japanese response was always the same: surprise, resistance, collapse. By the summer of 1944, American carriers were operating within sight of the Philippines. By early 1945, they were launching strikes against the Japanese home islands themselves. The floating airfield had become a siege engine. The transformation was not merely tactical, it was conceptual. The battleship had represented the culmination of a philosophy that valued concentration, durability, and overwhelming firepower at a single point. The carrier represented the opposite: dispersion, mobility, and the ability to project power across vast distances without being tied to a fixed position. In a sense, the carrier was the naval equivalent of guerrilla warfare, refusing to meet the enemy on his terms, striking from unexpected angles, and disappearing before a counterattack could be organized. But unlike guerrilla forces, which are typically weak and poorly supplied, the American carrier task forces were rich in resources. They combined the advantages of mobility with the advantages of industrial supremacy. They were everywhere and nowhere. They could not be pinned down, could not be starved, could not be defeated in a decisive engagement because they refused to fight one. The Japanese had built a strategy around the decisive battle, the single cataclysmic engagement that would destroy the enemy fleet and force a negotiated peace. The Americans had built a strategy around attrition, the relentless, methodical destruction of enemy resources until nothing remained. Truk was not a battle, it was a demonstration. The few journalists who were permitted to accompany Task Force 58 struggled to convey the scale of what they had witnessed. One correspondent, writing for the New York Times, described the attack on Truk as the most complete naval victory in American history, but the phrase felt inadequate.
Victories implied struggle, conflict between relatively equal forces. Truk had not been a struggle, it had been an execution. Another correspondent, more perceptive, wrote that Truk represented the death of the Old Navy. He did not elaborate, but those who read the dispatch understood. The Old Navy, the navy of battleships and cruisers, of fleet engagements and gun-line duels, of Jutland and Tsushima, had ceased to exist. A new form of naval power had emerged, one that bore little resemblance to anything that had come before. And at its center was the carrier, the floating airfield that had been mocked, dismissed, and underestimated, now revealed as the most potent instrument of sea power in history. In the years after the war, when historians attempted to identify the turning points of the Pacific conflict, they often focused on the spectacular battles: Midway, Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea. But states would demand a negotiated settlement. It was the strategy of a power that knew it had already lost. The wreckage remains. Truk Lagoon, now known as Chuk Lagoon, is one of the largest underwater graveyards in the world. More than 50 Japanese ships lie on the bottom, many of them still intact, their holds filled with trucks, tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. Divers who descend into the lagoon speak of a haunting stillness. The sunlight filtering through the water in pale shafts, illuminating the rusted hulls and coral-encrusted gun turrets of vessels that sank in minutes. Inside the ships, personal effects remain: sake bottles, helmets, boots, photographs. Skeletons lie in crew compartments and engine rooms, the remains of men who went down with their ships. The lagoon is protected now, a historical site, but it is also a grave. For the Japanese sailors and airmen who died there, Truk was not a fortress, it was a trap. For the American pilots and sailors who attacked it, Truk was proof of something they had always believed but could not yet articulate: that freedom conferred a material advantage. Democratic societies, for all their inefficiencies and internal contradictions, possessed a quality that totalitarian states could not replicate: the willingness of individuals to work together toward a common goal without coercion. The American Carrier Task Force was not held together by fear or ideology, but by shared purpose. The deck crews who armed the aircraft, the pilots who flew them, the engineers who maintained the engines, the cooks who prepared the meals, all of them understood that they were part of something larger than themselves. They did not fight because they had been ordered to, though they had. They fought because they believed that the world they were defending was worth the cost. This belief was not propaganda, it was lived experience. The United States, for all its flaws, had given them lives worth living, and they were willing to risk those lives to preserve the possibility that others might live the same way. The Japanese pilots who opposed them fought with equal bravery, but they fought for an empire that had given them nothing except the honor of dying for it. In the end, that difference mattered more than tactics or technology. The floating airfield had been laughed at, but the laughter had stopped long before the bombs fell on Truk. It stopped when the carriers struck at Wake Island in 1942, at Rabaul in 1943, at Truk in 1944, and at Tokyo in 1945. It stopped when the Japanese realized that the ocean, which they had always believed to be their shield, had become the Americans' highway. The sea did not protect Japan, it exposed it. And the instrument of that exposure was the carrier, the ungainly, vulnerable, improbable vessel that had proved itself the most effective weapon of the modern age. Not because it was invincible, but because it could be built faster than it could be sunk. Not because it was perfect, but because it was good enough. And in war, good enough, produced in overwhelming numbers, always defeats perfection produced in insufficient quantity. February 17, 1944, was not the end of the war. 18 months of brutal fighting remained. But it was the end of doubt. After Truk, no one questioned whether the carrier could project power, whether democracy could mobilize resources, whether the United States possessed the will to see the war through to total victory. The floating airfield had answered all of those questions in a single, devastating demonstration. And in the wreckage of Truk Lagoon,
Beneath the black smoke and burning ships lay the wreckage of an empire that had mistaken laughter for wisdom and isolation for security, and discovered too late that the world had changed and that the new world belonged to those who could adapt, endure, and prevail.